What's up, seekers of the secrets of shred? Welcome back, Death to the Fingers. Your host, as always, the dumb idiot that thinks that making videos on the internet's doing anything of value. Here we are, though. Anyways, I thought we could talk about Diminished and Dominant 7 and how to factor that into the pentatonic stuff. We've talked a lot about just the pentatonic scale and arranging it and understanding it as a sound and essentially exploring the fretboard, using that as the sort of exoskeleton to map out the fretboard. But now, obviously, we need to add other elements to sort of train our ear. So we're like, okay, I'm using this correctly or I'm not. Did you hear what I said there? You have to use your ear. This is not a skill that you can pick up by basically watching a video. You have to play a shit ton of music and then be adventuresome enough to be like, okay, I'm going to throw in Dominant 7 or Diminished. And then when you do get it right, you'll be like, okay, point of note. And when you get it wrong, you should also be like, okay, well, what's right? You hear what I'm saying there? That's a missing piece of the equation that so many people skip over. They're like, obviously that didn't work. Well, what does? So, yeah. We're going to kind of go through it here. Obviously, what I'm going to do here is just talk a little bit at the beginning. If you want to, you can just scrub through to the intro screen and then you'll see all the actual videos. But some of the basic ones are essentially learning the systems. You have the pentatonic system, understanding that when you start on whatever root, in this case G, I'm going to take the scale degrees 1, 2, and 3, 5, and 6 from the G major scale, which are G, A, and B, D, and E. And I'm going to play those and I get a major pentatonic because I'm starting from the first degree. That's the Ionian mode. That's the major scale. So now I have a major pentatonic. Oh my God, shocker, right? So when I do it from the 6th degree, what do I get? The Aeolian mode. Oh yeah, that's the natural minor. There's the Dorian mode, Dorian pentatonic, Phrygian pentatonic, so on and so forth, and then starting to hear that sound, and of course using it, as I said, as the exoskeleton to essentially map out the fretboard so you can be like, relative to this, I can do this. Now that's an incredibly powerful training tool because now you're not just taking a stab in the dark, you're establishing some basic rules like 2 + 2 = 4 for yourself. You'll pick out the sounds that sound right to you. I'm going to show you a couple, tried and true ones. Hopefully you can tell the difference when I'm doing it wrong and when I'm doing it right, which I do, obviously. And that leads to the next question, which is you have to basically be able to recognize when something doesn't mesh together properly and when it does. And when it doesn't mesh together, then that means you need to do something else. What is that? You know what I mean? And then kind of reverse engineer, because I bet you that'll lead to a whole bunch of other truths as well. And you'll be able to use those other places. So you sort of kill two birds with one stone. Plus, you gain the significant actual usable knowledge to start to manipulate the major scale and all the rest of it, your soloing ideas in this way, which is the supreme level of music mastery. Once you understand how to blend Dominant 7 with the modes and Diminished as well, these two tensioned tones, these huge branches of music, let's just call them like, the yin and yang of sort of like what gives you the tool to sort of like blend in with the major scale to give it like interest in musical flavor. What the high-end musicians are calling the surprise factor, meaning if you're not doing something that's capturing my attention, maybe it's good enough for the plebs, but it's not going to be good enough for me, so it's next. And at the end of the day, I think a lot of musicians want other musicians' sort of recognition to a certain degree to be like, oh yeah, no, that was really badass. It's kind of part of it, right? So, you got to be a little discerning and whatnot, overly harsh, no, but definitely be like, well, it was pretty good, but you didn't really pop out. What is it about one of these classic rock or metal albums or whatever it is that you listen to that jumps out at you and makes you be like, that's why this is so iconic to me? A lot of people, or especially musicians, don't analyze that to a certain degree. So it becomes an issue. So that's what I'm getting at is there's this whole training platform where you have to actually use the pentatonic scale as like the simplest sort of interpretation of the major scale systems. However you're going to do that, 3 notes per string or the classical method, whatever, your call, or a combination thereof. I don't know. 3 octave series in there too, blah, blah, blah. Right? So the takeaway is you got to pick those systems and sort of marry them up. So you can be like, the more I practice blending these 2 flavors, in this case, I'm just ascending one and descending the other. But later on, you might do like jumping back and forth and all kinds of complicated ideas that make it sound really, really, really badass. And it's not that hard, right? So, well, it's not easy, but it's not like the end of the world either once you start playing at this level. And it's really about the sound. It's not about the shred. That's why I kept it really slow today and just simple, straightforward. It's about these sounds blending. And you'll notice when one sound sort of flows to the next, it sounds right, air quotes. You sort of notice it a lot more than when you play the wrong one. You know what I mean? They both kind of work, but one more so than the other. Let's put it that way. One just sounds a little bit better. Now, does that mean you can't use the other one? No, it does not. But listen, you got to start off with the obvious. So the example that I do, I move from Locrian into Ionian. When I'm doing that, I use dominant 7 into the actual major scale stuff. And then when I move to the next one, I go to diminished so that I can go back into the major again. You see what I mean? So there's like these established rules. If I want to go from diminished to the Ionian mode, I have to start up in Dorian rather than play the one down in Locrian, because it won't sound as awesome if I do it like this. You know, to keep it relatively simple without actually trying to ram the theory thing home, there's just like, it sounds more complete. So you have to develop the force power, you know, to be like, recognize that shit and practice it. So you got to start off with the basics, right? And so at the end, you see me of the sort of, you know, here's the wrong way, here's the right way. You'll see that I take it to the extreme with the scale, in this case, the half whole tone scale, starting in the Locrian position to ascend, so that I can then descend in the first inversion major triad, right, in G major at B. And then from there, of course, I do a major pentatonic using the 3 and 2 technique we talked about in the last video or whatever it was on pentatonics. And essentially, boom, there it is. The Holy Grail, if you will. So I'm doing sort of the opposite. I'm now using a diminished type scale. The whole tone scale is another one. Whole half tone's another one. I'm sure there are more. But my point being is these ones are pretty ubiquitous, right? And that's just it. You start at the bottom and you work up from there. So if you can't make these primary colors work in some sort of context, then you'll never get them to work, right? That should be a no-brainer. So you might be like, well, I've been messing around with them for a long time. It's just not really panning out. But I hate to say, you just got to keep fucking around with it. Took me decades to get stuff to work properly. It was just because I wasn't thinking about it correctly, but that's just it. Making the mistakes is the training platform, as long as you just don't hold on to them and be like, oh, this is my holy grail. You're constantly trying to refine, you know, get down to like the purest source. So you're like, this is like the ground zero. If I'm moving from the Locrian position in any key up to Ionian, so from 7 to 1, if I want to create some sort of sense of resolution, I'm going to use dominant 7 and I'm going to use some sort of major. The major pentatonic, the major scale, some other thing that may be sympathetic to the major scale, like Lydian or Mixolydian, right? So I think you're getting the idea here. It starts off with this really basic premise, and then all of a sudden you kind of create a musical law for yourself to be like, this is where it sounds the best, most natural. When you just play these two things, it just fits. It's like grilled cheese sandwich, bro. Although that's 3 ingredients, but whatever. So, you know, and at the end here, of course, you see me expanding out to, of course, try to approach it in a different way. So instead of doing an arpeggio sequence, why not use the diminished scale? How can I get that to work? And I'm like, well, if I go from this diminished scale into the major arpeggio, that has a really nice sort of resolution on itself, right? Obviously diminished to major, that's like ground zero. But then to move it down into the pentatonic territory, of course, breaks up that sort of like major mode kind of feel. You know what I mean? Just subtly. It doesn't subtract enough notes for it to be like, wow, that was awkward. Instead, it just kind of, and it's a 5-note sequence. So you really get like double the benefits. And you could sequence it too, which would be pretty amazing. So there's that. So that's my little splurb, right? With regards to diminished and dominant 7. It's not about, effectively just learn them to be like, oh, look, I've mastered these over the fretboard. Start to use that as a tool to create resolution. So once you understand that the pentatonic scale or the major modes, 3 notes per string, whatever it is, that's the bedrock. You need something to sort of start to manipulate and create tension and release, but still related to the bedrock. And then later on, you can start using superimposition to take it to the extreme, like the top guys. Done deal, right? But it's up here. It'll never happen here, ever, until you get it up here. And you can't get that knowledge unless you just sit there and be like, okay, I got to start messing around with diminished and dominant 7. Start in the Ionian position. Locrian to Ionian. Figure out the arpeggio shapes, start learning them. Use the pentatonic scale, the major scale, 3 notes per string, whatever you're going to do there, the classical method, and then practice those 2 things together. And then start playing like a vamp, 1 chord, right? So you're going to start with a G major chord or whatever. And then practice the diminished over the G major chord going into G major and be like what that is. Feel it. And you're like, diminished over the major scale? Yeah, exactly. And don't mess with it too much. Understand what that sound is in the context of this thing being constant. Once you can do that, you can start moving that sound around relative to what it is that you want to play next. That unlocks the door. But if you don't have ground zero, how are you going to have anything to, measure it against? You see what I'm getting at? So, yeah. We'll leave it there. Here are the examples. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you in the next one.